Okay. Hello. We're getting started roughly a minute early. Just wanted to make sure all the hardware and everything works. We did this a couple weeks ago, and let's say made some assumptions using OBS and other software that everything would kind of come together, and ran into some technical issues. But I think this week we're going to be in a much better place. Although I have to turn off the AC and everything to get the audio right. So they get a little hot in here, but we'll see how it goes. So I want to welcome everybody to the demo this week, the live stream. We're going to be going through our new KMBridge template library and talking a bit about the features and whatnot. I'm actually going to jump ahead and do something right now first that normally I would do after a bunch of introduction and talking, but it takes a little while to build things. So we're going to, do a nonlinear story here and start with, we're going to go to the template, or KMBridge template that you can use to publish Kotlin builds to your Android and iOS consumers, internal or external. We'll talk about more later, but let me just get started here. We're going to create a new repo from this template, and we'll call it, I guess live demo. See, it's not taken. All right, we're not going to do anything else. And the thing you need to do, the only thing you need to do if you want to publish SPM and Android builds is change the group. You do have to change this. GitHub gets a little weird if you're publishing to GitHub packages with the same artifact coordinate, even if they're not in the same repo. I don't know why, and that may have been fixed at some point, but we're gonna not chance it. So we change the group, we'll commit that, and then we're gonna kick off a build because this takes a little while, and we'll get back to it. So once that gets started, we'll see that building, and then we'll move on with our chatting. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. So going back to the camera here. That is running, and we'll get started with the demo proper. So I'm Kevin Galligan. Welcome to the live stream we're doing today. I'm the technology partner for Touchlab and the Kotlin GDE. Generally do a bunch of Kotlin stuff, actually now involved with the Kotlin Language Foundation on the ecosystem, very involved in the ecosystem, libraries and all that stuff. And it's work, but it's kind of the thing I like to do anyway, so it works out, right? I'm just kind of a KMP fanatic. If you talk to me for any length of time, you'll understand that. Touchlab, if you're not aware, we are a services business that focuses on Kotlin multi-platform, and that takes a lot of facets. I mean, we do a lot of open source stuff, but that's not, open source is not necessarily how you pay the bills. We build apps from the ground up. We do internal SDKs for orgs. It's quite a bit of that, actually. We'll talk about that a little later in the demo, and then certainly next week we have some other content coming out. We help teams just come in and help you get started with KMP, on the right foot. There's a lot of stuff to figure out. Things like that, or just come in and build, shared modules or whatever. We're a services business, which means if it's something related to Kotlin or just making apps, please reach out, because that's what we do. So in that line of work, I would say we have we tend to talk more to teams. And let's see here, just checking Slack to make sure there's no emergencies, pardon me. We tend to work a lot with teams, and one thing that is true of the Kotlin multi-platform documentation, samples and tools and everything else, but I would say is not unique to Kotlin. It's the same thing with every new technology ecosystem and tools in the open source world, not necessarily enterprise. It starts as a focus on the developer. Like, get started here, run this thing, do this thing, and then you see this thing come out. And that's, of course, where you have to start, right? But as things mature, as teams need to go to production, there is this whole category of things that are team related or production related or serious production deployment related, problems, things you don't run into as a local developer doing, let's say, early stage stuff, things you don't have to worry about. And that is a lot of what we focus on. That is what is happening now in the ecosystem, because KMP went from alpha to beta, stable soon. I believe that's a thing everyone knows. And as that happens, teams have been going to production with KMP for years now, but the regularity of that has increased quite a bit, and the teams that are doing that are now not necessarily all early adopters with a willingness to put in tons of extra work to figure out problems that no one's figured out before. And again, this is something that happens in every tech ecosystem as it matures, and KMP is in that maturation phase. We also focus on very specifically issues with the iOS developer experience, and just how you consume these libraries, how you interact with them, how you develop with them, how teams interact with them, and essentially just making this a more productive and user-friendly, developer-friendly situation. That's a lot of what Touchlab has been focused on. And what we're talking about today is KMMBridge. KMMBridge is a tool. There's a sort of an ecosystem set of things around it that would imply that it does a bunch of things. It only really concerns itself with creating a consumable Xcode binary artifact and publishing it, right? So very basically, it takes the Xcode frameworks that you're outputting from your Kotlin compiler, and it converts them to XC frameworks, which is a detail that's a little beyond this talk, but it's good to go in and read those basics and understand them. Makes an XC framework, and then it zips them all into one big magic zip file, which is actually consumable from various dependency management providers. And that zip file gets pushed to a server somewhere, and where that is something that you have to define. KMMBridge comes with some stock options out of the box, but it could be anywhere you need to go, really, in theory. We currently support Maven repos, which is a little confusing because we're not using Maven repos for dependency management so much as just a bucket to store the zip file in. But Maven repos, and currently S3, Amazon S3, which, caveat, you can't really do private files there directly. This is this is beyond this live demo in Cambridge. So it would be exceptionally difficult for us to try to prospectively provide, documentation for everybody. What we have out of the box, we're going to demo today, is GitHub. A very simple GitHub flow, and the only reason we do that is because, reasons. Many people are on GitHub, and out of the box, using GitHub Actions and GitHub packages, we can do a lot of things automatically, right? Like what you just saw at the beginning, if you watch from the beginning, was me take that repo and kick off a build without even opening the code and making one change. That's how simple this is. Caveat, if you're using SPM, if you're using CocoaPods, it's more complicated. But if you're using SPM, that's all you really need to do. Setting up other CI environments is necessarily more complicated. And again, if you want help with that, Touchlab exists doing these things, but just prepare. Any production environment takes that kind of work. So anyway, that's what KMMBridge does. It publishes iOS binaries. Now, why? Why would you do this? And we'll cover this in summary. This is a long discussion, and there's a lot of things, a lot of reasons you might want to do this. But again, the KMP tooling is focused on everybody is going to build Kotlin locally. It usually kind of assumes a mono repo. It assumes that everyone's going to be okay with installing the tooling and doing everything. In reality, from the first early days of working with teams, and we really were going back to, believe it or not, 2018, late 2018, early 2019, we were working with teams, putting this in production, into their production workflows. And right out of the gate, adding the Kotlin build tooling and adding the Kotlin build step, all this stuff was something that most teams were not okay with when they were starting. So this is one of those things. If you have an existing native mobile team, to try KMP, although in theory it's very straightforward, it is rather difficult because I won't say always, but usually the iOS side is a little skeptical, and there's nothing special about that. Like Android people are skeptical about any other cross-platform thing, right? Because everyone's been burned, and they also like their tools, and their tools currently work, so changing them sucks. So the iOS team generally is skeptical. It's much easier to say, here's a framework you can incorporate that does something that you don't want to do, right? Like analytics. Nobody likes to do analytics unless you're a marketing person. It's not many marketing people that are also developers. So and it's easy to mess up because it's usually just a spreadsheet with a bunch of strings, right? So we recommend making a typed analytics library, and you can put that into KMP and just say, here's a framework and call these things. So what you want to do is provide a binary rather than tell everyone to install all this tooling. And especially if you're an Android-focused developer who doesn't have a ton of production Xcode build experience, to get KMP to build and publish these libraries successfully in a way that is secure for your environment and then consume them, it's a lot just to even try KMP. So one of the major use cases for Cambridge, especially this flow, is you want to try KMP. You can have some code in your app in an hour. Now, the code that we're publishing here has nothing to do with your app, so you have to go change the code, but you can have this workflow integrated enough to at least try it. So if you've thought about trying KMP, or you have in the past with your team and everyone said no, or you abandoned it because your hack week didn't provide enough time to do this, I would suggest definitely taking a look now. We're gonna have more content around that because this and Sky makes the experience much better, right? So trying KMP is a primary use case for Cambridge, but also just publishing a binary. There is also, I would say, an assumption in many of the folks that are the thinking folks, and whatever that means, in the KMP world, that you start that way, but eventually you got to get to everyone builds locally. And I would say that is only true if your team is small or your app is small. Large teams, larger teams, enterprise stuff, big apps, forgetting KMP, they will modularize and produce internal SDKs just because teams can't scale like that. So there's a lot of feature teams, and or at least that's one way that they do it. So you'll have a feature over here, and you'll have a test harness app over here that just tests that feature, and then later you pull it into the big app. So that is definitely a use case for this as well. And I would say that the Cambridge is a good model. The Cambridge sample we're going to do is a good model for that, although you'll definitely need to customize it if you're at that scale. Like, there's no way it's going to work out of the box for you. I'd be shocked. But that's how big teams work, right? And going a step beyond that, one of the things that we've done a fair bit is, again, internally with organizations, they'll publish an SDK for other parts of the organization to use. And we do some of that. This is definitely one of the situations. And some of the things we're adding now, we're trying to make that even more straightforward, like being able to bundle Swift into your package. It's TBD. We can do it with Sky. It's just not documented, and some of that experience isn't great. Specifically because the Kotlin compiler will name things at the end of the compilation, and you have to kind of know them. Although if it's your app, you probably do, but you don't get code completion anyway. Way beyond this live stream. Everything's a call these days. It's like I'm talking to Zoom, but to everybody at once. Anyway. Private SDK deployment. Another thing that if you're not sort of near the enterprise world, you've probably never heard, is called inner source, which is like open source, but internally to an org, which is another thing that we are very soon publishing again, service. Got to sell services. We're a services business, specifically around doing that for orgs, because we've done that a few times at KMP, and it's worked rather well, and it is something that folks are interested in. It's neat. Anyway, that's another use case. Finally, if you are publishing an SDK, and this spans a range, the extreme end of this is you are publishing something public for the whole world, and it's going to be in a public thing. I don't think there's a ton of that with Kotlin yet, but it's certainly possible, and it's something you can do with Cambridge. There's a lot more of, I would say, you're publishing an SDK to a limited set of customers. So maybe you make something that's for other businesses and you have like maybe 10 clients that you're ever going to publish to. This is something that we're done and we should be doing soon with some other folks. And then there's the next step beyond that, which we've talked to a few people doing this, which is you are a vendor that has many potential customers. It's not like a fixed set and you're publishing SDKs. There's more around that with documentation and things like that. And there's a lot of particular issues with that. Again, in the next few weeks, we're gonna be talking more about SDK publishing. That's the next thing we're going into. I would say in that category, there aren't a lot of people who aren't writing a full switch wrapper around their SDK and hiding the Kotlin interface, so to speak. But a lot of what we're doing with Sky should allow you to just write your Kotlin and publish it with caveats, of course. So these are the use cases. Why publish, right? Another thing I just want to mention here that's important, and this goes back to development team workflows. There, again, if you have a small team, I do think it's good to have everybody eventually get into building Kotlin locally and having that be the flow rather than publishing SDKs. The problem with publishing not just Kotlin SDKs, any shared code, and we've been doing this for a long time, before Kotlin too, and then the theory around it. If you're publishing an SDK and the people that are using your SDK are not editing that SDK at all, and this is more common in situations like if you're doing C++ or maybe some kind of weird JavaScript or whatever thing. Special cases currently are like if you're doing machine learning and you have Python, like this happens a fair bit. You have to be very explicit between those teams to describe the API that you need, and hopefully you don't forget anything, because then you got to wait. It's usually on some cycle, Sprintly or whatever you're going to do, so you got to wait a week or two. You could have bugs you don't have any way of debugging. Things you think are bugs that actually aren't bugs, you don't know, but you just file a bug, and things like that. Not being able to access the code is bad, and not being able to build locally and test is bad. It also never really allows the team that's using this to get into editing it. And again, if you're doing something like C++ or Python, okay, that makes sense. In this case, from a management team perspective, you really want to get into having the iOS developers and Android developers think of themselves more as mobile developers and contributing to that code base cooperatively. If the team's rather small. If it's large, it is what it is. But an important part of publishing is being able to flip a switch, as we call it, and to get flip a switch. Sorry, like flip a switch. What does that mean? It means we're consuming external APIs, but we can grab the Kotlin, build it locally, and be able to test it against that app in some way. So instead of pointing at the remote thing, just point at the local thing, and then do some debugging, do some testing, maybe some editing, and then you can publish a new version. And we think that's critical for any of these things. So KMBridge supports that. It supports CocoaPods and SPM. CocoaPods is easier to do the local switch. SPM's harder, but most people are moving to SPM, so that's a different discussion. But anyway, we'll get to that later. But that's what we want for local dev switch, and I think it's an important design feature of anything that's doing this type of thing. So what are we going to talk about now? We're going to go to the template, and we're going to switch back to our thing over here. Picture. Now, I had started that build at the beginning of this. It just finished. It is not a quick build, let's say, but let's take a step back and go to the template. So this is the template repo that we have set up. We have it's designed. It's set up for publishing KMP native mobile, right? So we're going to publish Android AARs. We're going to publish Xcode frameworks, and in theory, you could also publish, a KMP klib in case someone was going to consume this directly from another KMP consumer. But we're assuming that you want to publish to your native teams directly. You can create a new project from this. Again, it's a template. Create a new repo, and This setup is designed to use GitHub actions, and it uses GitHub packages. And we do that because, again, it's safe to say most people are using GitHub, and out of the box, we can do this with almost zero configuration. Again, the beginning of this demo, I just changed the group and started the build, right? So that's why we do it that way. And again, if you're going to set it up on your own, it's more work, but we can. There's more content around that, so you can check that out. We do this by way of a custom GitHub flow that we have created in another repo, and our GitHub actions call into that with a couple of parameters, right? So we'll talk about that more in a bit. What these parameters mean, essentially, it's just this, which JVM version is pretty self-explanatory, and this thing, which we'll talk about later, and it gets around the primary use case of what this flow is doing. And again, this is where we're going to separate from what does KMBridge concern itself with and what does this GitHub flow concern itself with. And this is more of an opinionated decision set that you need to understand and decide if you want to use or do something else, right? But essentially, for every build, this thing, we go briefly to this, hold on a second. This thing, essentially, this is the workflow. And when you get in here, it's doing a lot that you might want to customize, but it's checking out the code. It is getting some properties, and it's going to do a branch. It's going to do a build. It's going to, for SPM specifically, it's going to write out the package file, and then SPM does versioning in Git. So it's going to do a lot of stuff, and so it's important to understand what it's doing. So anyway, we're going to go back to the code, and we are going to take a look at what happened with this build. First thing to point out is we have Git tags. This first build was 010. Again, SPM uses Git tags for versioning, so you need to have this, and it's strict. You can't mess around. It's a semantic versioning, so that's how that works. We go to packages. We see that we've got these packages. You see my zoomed in face there. I gotta change the photo maybe. But we have Android debug. These you can just kind of ignore. And the special one here is KMBridge. We actually have our own, I forget the name, it's classifier, I think, but I'm not sure. So this just does that. And again, we don't care about Maven to provide our Xcode dependencies. And that's the only confusing part about this. We only use this because we can shove like a binary in here, and you can see that here. It's a little zip file, and that's all we really care about as far as the KMBridge specific packages. And we point to that actually very briefly. Like I said, I don't want to hold you up too much here because we got to get into some code. But if we go look at the commit here, the package file actually points directly at that. So that was that thing we were just looking at. Otherwise, we don't care about the Maven as far as Xcode is concerned. And but we'll talk about that a bit more later. So what we're going to do is clone this, and we're going to open it, and we're going to take a look. So bear with me here as I do this. Git clone. I tend to use IntelliJ. That's just how I roll. You can do whatever you want as long as it's IntelliJ or it's Android Studio. I assume you're not gonna try VS Code, and I'm not sure Fleet quite yet has the KMP stuff that you'll need. Hold on, just gonna take a quick look. And okay, nobody is. I'm just looking at, okay, sorry. I'm just making sure that there's no emergencies going on in Slack. Sorry. I turn off notifications. Pro tip, if you're doing anything from your screen, turn off your notifications, but that ruins my ability to see anything. All right, back to the demo here. Yes. So we've got that. We got the thing. So the first thing we're going to show here, this is the forked repo. We have a few modules, breeds analytics, all shared, and then this test app, which we will go into a little later. These correspond obviously to these breeds, analytics, all shared. The Android app will use breeds and analytics dependencies directly. You don't have to do it that way, and depending on how your design works, I kind of prefer a single entry point, but it depends what you need to do. The alt shared is an umbrella module, and that's where we're publishing our Xcode frameworks from. So if we go to analytics, again, I was mentioning it before, we often suggest something like this as your first KMP thing if you're going to introduce it to a team. Effectively what this is a typed analytics situation. So if you want to say I favorited some breed and I saved it, and then we call this from the code with just the ID and the Boolean, and that will ultimately produce the string events that you need for analytics. Analytics platforms vary, but generally speaking, it's just a bag of strings with a key, and that's very easy to not get correct, because it usually comes in the form of a spreadsheet from marketing, and what version are you on and where are you calling it, and did you get the case right and all that. This kind of gets around that, right? So the way that this is implemented, very briefly, we have an interface for analytics with just send event, which is event name, and then a map of args. Again, that is the universal signature for every analytics platform on the planet. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure I'm wrong, but I'm not that wrong. The idea is that when you start up this shared code from either platform, you pass in an implementation, and we'll briefly take a look at that. That's analytics. We won't go too deep into that. Breeds, this is logic from our camp kit sample, and essentially it is just calling an API. It's called dog CEO, and dog CEO gives you a bunch of dog breeds and then some images of dog breeds optionally. We wanted an API that was public and was simple and relatively meaningless. That's what this does. The big thing that we're going to show briefly later is actually the breed repository, which is exposing the data that these two things are really these two platforms are going to interact with. We won't go too much into it now, but again, we grab and store breeds. They're stored in SQLite, and we use flows to surface that data, plus the state of the data and the loading and all that kind of stuff out of the breed repository. So alt shared is the thing that you care about if you're doing a thing for iOS. And this is not available for the Android side in our design, just iOS main. And we essentially have this SDK handle, which is the thing that's returned that gives you access to these things. And we have an entry point where you pass in that analytics, because again, the platform specific. You can do that with C interop and all, but you don't want to. It's way worse. I'm going to briefly look at our comments. Follow quick start guide. Okay, no, that's not questions. By the way, if you have questions, you can put them in the comments stream. Assuming the comment stream doesn't get crazy, which it never really does in these kinds of streams, just drop them in there and we'll get to them later. We'll have questions at the end, and certainly you can reach out and have them whenever you would like later. So, okay, that is what alt shared is. So, I want to go in and briefly talk about how this actually works and what this workflow intends to do. So we're in live demo. We go into actions. Again, at the beginning, we ran this, and it built a whole version and did the whole thing. Now, if we go back into KMMBridge publish, actually, let me open a different one. We can see more stuff. But essentially, what happens is when you want to publish, if you go to all publish, it'll publish Android and iOS. If just iOS publish, it'll just publish iOS. And every time you want a new version, you just run that workflow, and it will add another number to the patch version and publish that. So it's 010, the next one will be 011. As you can imagine, that will work, right? So we'll go into this thing that's got a few more. You'll see that there were 3 publications, so 010, 011, 012. All right, every time you run it, it'll add a new one. There is some complication you can read in the docs around this, where if a publication fails midstream, you might have the binary file out in your packages, but you don't have the version tag. And it's a little weird. You can see it essentially, but we put a marker version tag when you start a build, and then you can see, I'll just show you. We're all here. We're all friends. Let's just run it, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then I'll cancel the build because I'm going to use this later for something else. I don't want to blow it up, but let's wait for that to start, and we'll see how this goes. The other thing about live demo with GitHub Actions is sometimes GitHub Actions takes a while to find an available runner, and then we just sit here and wait, which is going to not be great. So I'm going to talk first. We're almost there. Come on. There we go. And I'll actually just cancel this because we're already there. If you look at in our tags, come on, man, I clicked the button. Let's go. We add this auto version marker tag for 013. So if you see that and you're like, what's that? That is if this failed. Now the next time it'll run it, it'll actually try to publish 014 because you may have already published a binary. Enough about that. Don't worry, it all works. Actually, you are unlikely to have a failure during your build at that scale unless you're doing CocoaPods, because publishing the CocoaPods actually attempts to build everything and test it. And there are a lot of things that can go wrong, not with the code, just with the access to the repos. And you have to do SSH keys and stuff. We're not going to do CocoaPods today. If everyone really wants to see CocoaPods, we can do it, but it's just more steps. It's not terrible, but it sucks. All right. Anyway, let's go back to the code real quick. One thing to understand about how this works. Again, the idea of KMBridge and this flow is that we are using this for developer builds, and that's where the patch versions come from. So we can publish these developer builds at any time, and you can update them, and they're all going to be a base version, which is major, minor, and patch. And we define that for this particular flow in here. It's the library version. So it's 01, and then inside of our root build Gradle, we have this little block here, which is a little weird. From our flow, we pass an auto version, which is that calculated version with the extra patch. If we're not inside the workflow, then this doesn't exist, and it just pulls library version because Gradle does not like not having a version. I found that the hard way. So that's how that works. Okay, test apps. So we've got test apps, and the idea behind this is what I was mentioning earlier is if you're doing, let's say, a feature team or whatever. This is now our shared Kotlin module team. These are local apps you can run to test that things work, and they are directly connected into the repo. You can just open them and build them. I'm going to open the iOS app actually while we're here. Let me just test apps, iOS, and all right, so we'll do open iOS. I also was upgrading Xcode today, so we're just gonna have to hope for the best. Wish me luck. Anyway, so we opened that up, and we're gonna run the app. Let me just make sure we're on. Also, you got to change this. You got to be on a proper. If you can't run it for a desktop, you got to run it for an iOS build. Let me see. This is supposed to be larger. Yeah. Okay. So the source code is larger, not necessarily the interface of the IDE, unfortunately. So this is building. This is actually building the Kotlin, so it'll take a little while. But that's all you have to do. While it's building, we'll talk briefly about breed list screen, which has a view model, and the view model actually subscribes to our flows. Hold on, wait for this to start. Okay, yeah, right now there's no data, so you got to load data. It may fail. I throw in random failures. Yep, okay, random fail. And we'll probably get another one because, yeah, it's live. Why not? Let's just roll the dice. Oh, man, it's 50-50, so it's either, there we go. So that's how that works. And then when you favorite stuff, essentially we're calling into the shared code. The flows are sending this data back out, but we're also sending this app state. we have this breed view model. The breed view model is effectively listening to our flows coming from the shared, the breed repository, which I'll talk about later from the Kotlin side. This is using Sky, and Sky translates flows into async sequences, which is a structure that's part of the standard Swift async ecosystem. And it does that automatically and seamlessly. So Swift sees these as any other async sequence, and it participates directly in the async lifecycle. Down here, we loop over this data. So the breeds data itself is just coming as an async sequence, and we loop over it and set it in our published state, and same thing with events and state of the data. And this is just sort of metadata about what's going on with the state of the data. And we publish these, and that's used by the front end to do stuff. And again, the Swift lifecycle is going to automatically subscribe and unsubscribe, and there's bidirectional cancellation. It's neat. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. So if we go to breed repository, this is kind of getting, we're leaving the configuration, and now we're getting into the weeds of what we're doing actually here. So breed repository, it's like I'm flipping back and forth between my notes here. In earlier versions of this logic, and I would say our best practice for these kinds of things, you'd often wind up wrapping your Swift code, not your Swift code, your Kotlin code that gets exported to iOS with some sort of SDK border, for lack of a better description. So, we were exposing flows, but then we would have a callback mechanism and some sort of handle so you could manage the flow lifecycle. And we were only doing it with breeds. We really weren't sending out any app state data. And with Sky, and again, with things like KMP native coroutines, but Sky, obviously what we're using, especially the Sky design, was to try to get rid of the necessity of that layer. So you don't have to write this wrapper layer, and the developer can really export a Kotlin API in a way that is much more natural to what they would normally do with a Kotlin API. So that was really the design principle behind Sky, and this has changed from an earlier version of this to replicate that now. The main thing we added really was exporting these flows directly. We got rid of that callback API border, and I added some seal classes that are focused on the state of the data that are coming out. I will caveat this with, I was also trying to add some sealed interfaces and get a little clever with it. So I don't know that this is really a great design for sealed classes, but they're there, and essentially they point to whether it's empty or you have cache data, and then if you have this sort of unknown initial state, loading, error, or refresh success, and then this sort of sealed interface, which is more geared towards like something that we're showing on the front end. Good design, I don't know, but whatever. So let's say if we go back to Swift, and I do want to briefly talk about this, which is going back to the view model again is looping over these and setting these, but in the actual display screen, we if you go to line, we're on breed list content, right? Yeah, line 45. So this is actually, as the breeds come in and get set, we're just showing the data, right? So that's coming from the view model. Sorry, it's getting passed in here. So breeds view model, and if you don't know Swift UI, it's similar to Compose in conceptual ways. Like if the data changes, the UI recomputes, right? So that gets shown here. But down here is the stuff that's a little more interesting. So we take sealed classes or interfaces and allow you to do exhaustive switching over them and proper type casting here. So this one in particular, we have data events, which essentially is just what it was doing, that button thing, which I think corresponds to, let me see here. Yeah, that is okay. So initial, nothing, and the initial should be a transitory state, right? Like it's either it's got nothing or whatever. So you got loading and whoops, error and whatever. But again, there's no default here. It is exhaustive, and that's very important. And then also the results are cast to the correct thing. So we get result error and we can publish the name there. This other one is definitely that little weird one, because I had a sealed interface. And again, I don't know if this is great design, but we only care about certain events and states between these for the button. So it is, if you've got no data and it's empty, you load data. If you're cached, you can refresh, and if it's loading, it says refresh, but it's disabled. So good design, probably not, but that's what that's doing. And it's just important to point out that you now can publish sealed classes, you can publish enums, and they're exhaustive. You can use flows, you can use suspend functions and not worry about the thread or cancellation. Those are all supported. So it gives you a lot more, a much easier time to design your API you're publishing to iOS, right? So, Breed view model. I think the only thing I want to talk about with this briefly is one of the things that we're currently working on. And well, first of all, it's when you come in the Breed view model, we have this activate, which is itself an async function. This gets called from the front end. It's a task modifier, which essentially, when the task comes into view, you get, or the view comes into view, this task modifier gets called with an async context that's tied to the lifecycle of that view. And this gets started there, and it starts these loops that does these things. But this is definitely something that's a little, I wouldn't say low level, but it's verbose, and it's effectively trying to do the same thing that, and every time I move, it goes over my script. Composables. In our Android sample app, our composables are essentially doing the same thing, except they're just calling collect as state, with lifecycle in this case, but collect as state. And it's doing that automatically. And that's one of those things that we're looking at next of like, okay, how do we replicate that same thing, right? Like here's that published state in iOS, here's that published state in Android, and we want to essentially do this and tie it to the lifecycle. We're not there yet, but I don't think we're very far off. If anyone has ideas or, God forbid, would like to contribute something, please reach out. So, some other notes. This iOS app is doing direct integration, which is not using CocoaPods for local dev. We have a SPM local dev thing in Cambridge. It's not using that either because it's rather, it works, but it's not great. It's actually doing this embed and sign Apple frameworks thing. I have a short blog post coming out soon about how I used to avoid this, and I thought it was a real bad idea. But then the more I got into it, just for purely local dev, forgetting the switch that we talked about earlier, embed and sign is actually pretty good. And it tends to be pretty smooth. Very quickly, although we don't really care about this as much in this call, we are going to do the Android app. I gotta find it. Where is it? It's the device manager. It is not what I wanted. Oh, running devices. All right, there we go. Yeah, so it's the same thing. You have an Android app that's running here, and you can test out the code there too, right? So nothing too complicated. And that's basically it. So that's how you do the local test apps. Now, I'm going to show one more thing. I mean, I know we're going fairly long here, but I want to show, again, this is all SPM. We're not going to do anything with CocoaPods. We can if somebody wants to. One of the things that is happening these days is that CocoaPods is definitely lost market share, I would say. And SPM is kind of everywhere. And I think also for Kotlin, for KMP adoption, SPM support's critical. It's in there for a long time, and it's even more so now. So it also is, for this particular flow, much easier to get going. What I'm about to show you is where it gets a little tricky, but I am going to show integrating your SPM build with Xcode, and then how to do that whole switch of local dev and testing stuff out. So we are going to do a little movie magic and say that I am going to grab something I've already built, of course, and I created, oh wait, what am I doing here? Get clone repo. Oh, no. Okay. I did do something and then yeah, yada. Sorry, my script is a little off from where I landed about 10 minutes ago. This is the SPM local dev flow. It's part of the KMMBridge docs. I'm going to show it to you because it is a little complicated. But first thing we're going to do is say, take a, let me see if I got the right one. This should fail. That's not the right one. Sorry, apologies. Yeah, this is the, we had like a big phone call right before this. So it was like getting this all set up on the phone call. Okay, that's that one. And then where's this other one? Come on, buddy. Is it this one? You might be in trouble here. I might have to abandon this effort. But let me give it one shot here because I think I know where it is. I think I know what I did wrong here. Okay. I got it. So what I have here is a project, and this project is effectively the sample project that we've been working with, the local one, but I pulled it out and we're pretending like this is some new app that needs to get this SPM build. So we're gonna do this. This should fail. It did. It doesn't know what all shared is. That's obvious. So what we're going to do is then say, I want to add packages. And there's a lot in here. Read the docs. Like you have to set up local access. If it's a private repo, you got to do some extra stuff. We're not going to talk about that. But what we are going to do is, actually, I'm going to do this other one because it's a little more interesting. I'm not going to do the one we just built. I'm going to do the other one that I had built previously. So we're going to do my test app. Yeah. So my test app is that one I showed you where it had 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 2. And essentially what you got to do is get your GitHub repo, and you can just paste the GitHub repo URL in here, or you can search. I have too many repos, so I usually don't search, but you get it. Anyway, down here, it shows you C012, and what it's saying is up to the next major version, it'll auto update, which may not be what you want. So you might want to say up to the next minor version. So if you change the base from 010 to 012, then you have to explicitly do it. It's up to you. Anyway, we add that package. It's going to download it. Everything looks good. We get it there. We hit play. And then we get an app, right? Oops. And then we get an app. And that's all you really have to do to do that integration. So that's cool. But what if you want to do that local dev switch? So the only reason I'm showing this now is because it is so like, it's weird, and I want to show it visually so people get it. It is, here's the weird part about it. I have this code locally on my machine. I already cloned this out. You physically drag the repo local folder to Xcode. That's the thing that's really confusing. And the repo has package Swift in the root, which it very much always needs to. So we're going to drag this quite literally to here. Now you'll notice that did two things. It recognized that, and then the thing at the bottom we had that was pointing at all shared is gone. And what this is saying is, hey, I know what this is. I recognize it, and I'm going to use it. Now, there's a weird caveat, which is it is going to try to verify that your Git remote or Git name or folder name is the same as the actual Git repo. It's weird. So if you have a weird folder name or you're not using a Git repo, like it will not, it'll fail. So there's this kind of weird stuff that'll make it fail, but let's not get too caught up with that. We're going to go to breed repository and line 41, and I actually I made a little change here. So let me just comment it back in, and then you have to run for the local SPM dev flow, which again is something I was showing you earlier, which is something we implemented in KMMBridge. You have to run on the command line, and you also want to pass in a target, so you're not building all the targets, which takes forever. But for me, iOS simulator ARM. That was relatively fast, actually. Wow. Yeah, so we hit play again, and this should get our local changes rather than what was up there. See, we added hello to every row. That's how that works. And then if you're like, okay, we're good, we're done, commit this, push this, go back to the actions, run the build, and then essentially you delete this, make sure you remove reference, don't move to trash, and then you see it resolves our remote package 012. And whenever that 013 is built, you can go in here and say, essentially there's update packages down here. You say, update to latest package versions or resolve package versions or whatever, and you'll be able to see it and update. So that's how the local SPM dev flow works. Again, it's a little weird, but I don't know, talk to Apple. I don't know why they did it that way, but it works. So we're not going to talk too much about customizing the build. I said at the top, I just did a blog post yesterday about this, which is effectively just walking through our workflow and explaining what the steps are so you can make the decisions for your workflow. Of course, reach out, and of course, we're a services business, so if you want help with this stuff, of course, future content in the coming week or weeks, it's going to be SDK publishing that is internal, inner source, external, and public. We're gonna try to talk about that. I don't know if we're gonna get to all of it next week, but that's what we're gonna do. And of course, reach out, because we're on all of the various platforms and are happy to, respond and talk about stuff. So, questions. Let's see what we got. Does it provide a way to consume and integrate XC framework into a KMM project? As in, you have an external XC framework and you want to include it. No, it's like that's. These are all logically related, but quite different processes. So right now, if you want to include an external XC framework, you either have to do it manually or you can do the CocoaPods integration under the hood. That'll grab header files and run C interop and link to binaries and do all this stuff that you have to do. Again, logically related, very different operations. There's no SPM support for grabbing SPM frameworks. Certainly none for importing a Swift framework. That just doesn't work unless it's Swift that is Objective-C compatible, which is, it's a special subset. So no, it does not. That is a rather complicated process, and that is an ongoing area of discussion. But sorry. How to go from async sequence to flow, as in you want to go the other direction. That is a Thaddeus question. He's not on this demo, but he would have to answer that. I mean, it's definitely it's a deep divey thing for the Sky discussions. I don't think there's any. I would assume there's no automated way to do that. I mean, essentially you would loop over it and pass it into the flow. We actually do export some special fields. So if it's a state flow or a mutable state flow on the async sequence side, you actually have a value property that you can set. So in theory, you could loop over, I think, the async sequence and just set the value. Although I don't off the top of my head know if there's what the if that's problematic to do, because value might miss updates if you're within the same, I don't know what you would call it, sort of asynchronous loop of time. But that's a longer discussion. I wish I could answer that. It's certainly was much more focused on the how do you get SPM to not break for today's demo than getting deep in the weeds. But we're definitely would love to talk about any of these questions if anybody wants to bring them up. In Slack, we're often in the Kotlin Slack, of course. We have a dedicated channel, Touchlab Tools. Please ask in there. And we are doing content sort of dribs and drabs about specifics. We did something earlier this week about using sealed classes with generics and Sky, so for example. But yeah, please reach out with questions about Sky, because we're always thinking about that, especially pain points and things you think would be useful to add. Okay, I think that's it for questions. I'm going to do one last look into the Slack to make sure we don't have anything. No. So we had 2 questions, and sorry, both of them were no and I don't know, but you know, they're very good questions and very, very specific ones. So thank you, everybody, and I hope this demo was informative. I certainly hope that our technical issues were a little better resolved, and we'll see you next Thursday, assuming I get the SDK content in a state where it is ready to be prepared. All right, thank you. I just saw a question come in. Yeah, the family came in and was like, hey, you done? I'm like, yes. And I'm like, no. Any tips? Many tips. There is a migration article that goes over more about like Sky. One of the design goals of Sky, let's say, you know, not a absolute, because it's impossible, was to have the changes be source compatible with what you have. So, but it's just not possible to do that, because it's quite literally changing types. So there are cases where syntactically source will still compile and do what you expect, but certain things are impossible. Like if you're using flows with callbacks or whatever, you know, if you're using suspend functions with callbacks, if you're doing certain things with enums, like you're calling enums.values, it's changed. There are equivalents. So the migration doc has equivalents that you can use with the change types, and it has warnings, and also has, I would say, strategies to doing this in existing code base. So Sky's very configurable. I would say out of the box, I would try leaving enums alone, leave them on. If you're using suspend functions and flows out of the compiler, or you're using KMP native coroutines or whatever, I would turn those features off and enable them with annotations. But one of the things also I think people kind of don't think about much is, especially the folks that have existing KMP code bases, you've learned to avoid features that are bad, right? Like you've probably learned to avoid putting sealed classes out because that doesn't work well. And now that you have that feature back, it's almost a case of like, how would you go back and change the API you're exporting? Because now you can do those things. So that's a part of it. But you know, the tips are get the code, try, you know, read the migration guide, try to do it incrementally if you need to, and go through and change stuff to maybe be sealed classes or more Kotlin, canonical Kotlin, like how you would design it with Kotlin rather than what we've been doing for the last few years, which is how do you design a Swift API from Kotlin that isn't terrible, which means you're going to make choices you probably wouldn't make without that constraint. That Sky is trying to remove that constraint and make it less training for people writing Kotlin for Swift, and to make it less painful for people using Kotlin from Swift, and to preserve a lot of type safety features. The other answer, of course, is you hire Touchlab, because this is one of the things we do. So please reach out, and then we can come in and fix all of your problems. I promise. Anyway, okay, now I'm done. We'll see if the family comes back and wishes me well. All right, everybody. Thanks again.